However, the unity of the room was an illusion. While Bill Sterling leaned over the table, his mind already calculating the logistics of the plan, Yuri Galitzine remained in the shadows of the doorway. His eyes weren't on Kolditz, they were fixed on a smaller, blood-stained map of the Vosges. The betrayal at Moussi had left a jagged hole in the regiment's heart. 31 SAS men were missing, vanished into the grey maw of the Nachtund Nebula night and fog. Rumours, whispered by terrified locals and intercepted by the broken remnants of the resistance, pointed toward a place called Natzweiler. Galitzine knew Bill Sterling would never sanction a secondary mission that might jeopardize the rescue of his brother, though nothing formally had been declared about Josephine. The recovery of the lost 31 was a ghost hunt that Bill couldn't afford to indulge. The cold is a jealous mistress, Robbie had warned, but Galitzine knew that guilt was a more demanding one. As the others debated the thickness of the ice in Saxony, Galitzine quietly folded a requisition form for winter sabotage gear. He would go back to the Vosges. He would find them, or find their graves, but he would do it in the silence that Bill Sterling had commanded. As the meeting dispersed, Josephine reappeared and sorted with a cloth. She crossed to the window, watching the snow settle on the highland peaks. The world was shrinking to a singular, desperate point. "You're thinking about Leipzig," Henry Druce said, appearing at her elbow. "About William's broadcast." "About Milo." "I am thinking about the noise my brother makes," she replied, her gaze fixed on the white horizon. "He thinks he has silenced the resistance hub. He thinks that by nearly killing Milo, he's ended the game. But Milo is still breathing, and as long as that heart beats in Leipzig, the coordination continues. William has forgotten that we don't need a radio to find our way home. You know this because he broken bar, because she had found a way. A Gilly knew a forester who knew the postmistress in Perth, a broken bar who had a contact, an academic man who studied ancient Scotland, by the name of Douglas a broken bar. A broken bar, and Josephine knew enough Ogham to be able to write a message to Professor Douglas, whose brother happened to be called Ronald. Ronald MacDonald Douglas, a broken bar. Josephine held out the letter, and Henry glanced at the paper. Lines intercrossed a backbone line at different angles and spaces. "Looks like a broken bar, a bit like yin former broken bar." Druce looked up. "At Sherborne we used to communicate to one another using—" He broke off as Josephine fixed him with a look, and nodded slowly. She had found a way to Ronald Douglas, and had received an answer. Hurriedly, she turned to the fire in the drawing room, consuming heather for a change, and possibly the housekeeper's attempt to fragrance the place. Now it consumed the ancient Irish script with which she had found her answer. Her mind drifted to Sterling, of the infuriating sneer that masked a brilliant mind, of the hands she could still feel in the quiet moments of the night, of his cock in her, trying to break her spirit with the tightness of his fit. Josephine refusing to cave, but trying him harder, knowing it would infuriate him. She wasn't just going back for a major, she was going back for the man who was her purpose for living, for the moment. A broken bar. For the first time in her life she had a purpose, a broken bar, because of David Sterling. She turned to Henry, and for a moment, the mask of the so-operative had slipped. She swallowed and stepped closer to her compatriot. "We have to get David back, Henry. Not just for the war, for what comes after. If they will disband the SAS, our country will. Our country." A broken bar? "Why, Joe, that's the first time I have ever heard you say that." He shook his head and tutted, teasingly. "Irish resistance, a broken bar." Henry looked at her, then down at her hand, which was still resting protectively over her waist. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He simply placed his hand over hers, a silent pact between two survivors who were no longer fighting just for a flag, but for a future. She felt angry, sad. She felt frustrated that her body was weak, yet all she wanted to do was scamper from this place and rescue Sterling. Josephine smiled and invoked their method for calming down stressful situations. 21s, blackjack, old maid, chase the 8. Many a card game had settled their nerves as wheels and trucks and boots had gone by. "Will you come up?" Josephine nodded towards her room, and bring your playing cards. 88,888,888. While the men bled on the moors on the day before Hogmanay, the War of Shadows reached a fever pitch. In a locked study, Yuri Galitzine met Josephine's weary gaze over a spread of aerial reconnaissance. He spoke in a low, frantic staccato, his eyes darting to the heavy oak door. It has to be at the same time, Josephine. The same time as Big One. When the sky over France turns black with silk, that is when I strike for Natzweiler, Yuri whispered. If Bill knows I'm diverting resources for 31 missing men while David is still in a cage, he'll have me court-martialed before I can prime a fuse. But we cannot leave them in the fog. Josephine nodded, her face pale. She knew he would have to concede. The prince. She knew the scale of the diversion. Down south in Kent, Dudley Clark was weaving a masterpiece of thin air and rubber, columns of fake inflatable tanks and plywood ships gathered at Dover, a phantom army designed to scream Calais while the real blade sharpened for Normandy. Dudley is selling the Germans a lie they desperately want to believe, Josephine murmured, her voice strained. But we are the ones who have to live in the truth of the cold. The training intensified as December died a death. Nights filled with spirit and planning and strategy, and food days with marches through snow and ice and kens and glens. Paddy Mayne was relentless. He drove them through the waist-deep snow of the Cairngorms, pushing Druce, almonds, and Sea Kings until their lungs burned with the intake of sub-zero air. Josephine refused to be spared. She ran the rig lines with a heavy pack, her jaw set in a grim line of Irish defiance. She was a Maine. After all, she would not be the weak link in the chain that pulled David Stirling from the dark. However, during a live-fire exercise in a frozen gully, the world suddenly tilted. The sharp, rhythmic crack-crack of the guns faded into a dull roar, like the sea in a shell. Move, Josephine. You're exposed. Henry Druce's voice came from 1,000 miles away. She tried to pivot, to drop into a firing position, but a searing cramp rippled out in her lower abdomen. Her knees hit the permafrost with a sickening thud. The snow was blindingly white, then suddenly, it was grey. Joey. Paddy was there in an instant, his massive frame shielding her from the wind. He saw the way she curled inward, her hand trembling as it clutched her midsection through the thick wool of her smock. I'm fine, she wheezed, the light tasting bitter in her mouth. Just the altitude. Paddy's eyes were hard, shimmering with a mix of fury and a rare, jagged grief. He looked at Henry, who had rushed over, his face a mask of concern. She's done for the day, Paddy growled, his voice brooking no argument. Druce. Henry stayed with her that evening, as the start of 1944 began. Bagpipes and singing signaled the dying days of 1943. Josephine lay on the bed, exhausted. Not even a card game with Henry would keep her eyes from closing. Should we get the doctor? Bill Stirling asked of Paddy Mayne, uncharacteristically unsure of the course of action. Our doctor, Alistair Clarkson. Edinburgh. Paddy shook his head. She's mourning something. Or someone, Paddy added. It's melancholy. Give her something useful to do that she is not turning her energy up with us in the mountains. Stop her writing those reports to Clark. It's an action here that's making her want to come out with us and killing her in the process. Those reports are making her remember some terrible things. I know, Bill replied, thinking of the unbounded detail with which Josephine had filled the pages, some of which he most definitely did not want to know about. It's like a sort of penance. I'll tell Dudley Clark she has relayed the rest to me verbally. She can help the Women's Institute with the Red Cross parcels. And then what? After the big one? Paddy sipped the single malt whiskey, made on the Stirling estate. The best had been saved for Hogmanay. Yuri thinks they can drop and take Natzweiler, Bill continued. Auchinlech will never sanction a drop in January, especially if it will divert resources. I think he's come around to the idea, Paddy replied. But this is doing no one any good. We are action men, we don't do well in cages. And you know the SAS, they are famed for not listening to orders. Like the SAS, Bill told his friend, and raised his glass to the SAS, and the SAS. Paddy lifted his too, the amber spirit glowing in the peat firelight. To the new year, Bill announced to all in the drawing room. As the grandfather clock began to strike midnight, may 1944 be the last year of this wretched war.